Yeah. Okay. We can go to part two, which is important terms that the audience should know about sociocultural theory, and we could connect this discussion on linguistics, because one of the things that I found very interesting about SAT is that it has quite a fluid understanding of meaning, just like you were saying, communication is the root, and then forms are put into the
Hmm.
the process of trying to communicate meaning. So, can you talk a little bit about this idea of novices and veterans, and something that's called a functional overlap of meaning? For example, there is this example of the adult and the child watching the dolphin, and the child says, "What is that?" And that's a dolphin. But the dad has a completely different idea of the
Yeah,
word dolphin, and
yeah,
the child is just looking at the animal, and that's the only connection he has right now. So it's a sort of novice versus veteran. And also,
yeah.
is that could we make a comparison of adults and children with proficient L2, people proficient in a language, and someone who's learning that language, as a sort of also a relationship of novice and veteran?
Yeah. So when you look at meaning as the key, you begin to see language in a very different way. So it is the case that the problem is that children, or I shouldn't say the problem, the fact is that children are kind of locked into the here and now. So, you know, at some age, they can only think about what they can perceive. And so, Piaget showed this in experiments with, children closing their eyes and thinking that something they've been looking at disappears and no longer exists because they can't see it, right? Um, and so when a child looks at, let's say, an animal, the example you give of a dolphin, it doesn't have a concept of dolphin or a concept of mammal for sure.
Mhm.
It only understands the object that's before it as a dolphin. So the dolphin is that particular individual. And if you show the child a different dolphin, at some point they resist calling that other thing a dolphin
Mm.
because they don't have the concept of dolphin, right? But adults, because they have a fully formed linguistic system, excuse me,
Mhm.
um, understand what they're looking at is an object, but they're also looking at it as representative of a concept,
Mhm.
of a broader generalizable category of dolphin. So even if there are slight variations in the coloration, or if it's somehow damaged, an injured dolphin, let's say with one eye or one flipper, it still understands that it's a dolphin.
Mhm.
But a child looking at the same object would say, no, that's not a dolphin because it's missing a flipper. That's not my understanding of dolphin, right? So, and what the child then has to master is the concepts. And Vygotsky wrote a lot about the importance of concepts
Mhm.
and what that does for our thinking. As our concepts grow, our thinking changes. And the concepts, of course, come through our culture, right? They're culturally formed. Um, and so as the child forms concepts, their thinking grows, which means they can begin to think about things that are not just categorical, but they can think about things that are not in their immediate environment,
Mhm.
right? So we can talk about dolphins sitting where you are and sitting where I am, even though we're not observing dolphins. We have the capacity
Mhm.
because we have the concept, right? So if you bring this into second language, and this is an interesting issue with all kinds of interesting implications.
Mhm.
Um, as a late language learner, like as an adult trying to learn a second language,
Yeah.
already has a fully formed conceptual system,
Yeah.
most likely in their first language, right? So the question is, when you communicate through a second language, you might be using the structural side of the language, but are you using the conceptual side of the language? Or is the language just simply sort of relexified L1 to some extent, right? So is your thinking, are you able to think through the L2 to mediate your thinking, or are you thinking through the L1 with an L2 structure, right? L2 words, right? And you can see this showing up really nicely when you look at polysemy in language and metaphor and figurative language, right? Where it's really hard for people, even with high levels of let's say, proficiency, um, to use figurative language in a second language, to use metaphor. That's a very difficult thing to do. That's a really significant change in the conceptual organization of the person's mind, right? So, I've been speaking Spanish for a long, long time, and when it comes to metaphors, not idioms, not frozen metaphors, but using the language metaphorically and figuratively, that's a hard thing for me to do, because you don't understand the ways in which metaphors are formed in the other language. What's the target and what's the vehicle, right? What are legitimate vehicles in Spanish to represent certain targets, and so on and so forth. We did some studies of that 15 years ago on cross-language metaphor use, and it's very difficult. So I think when you look at language semantically, semiotically, and not just structurally, you can begin to see these real interesting issues showing up that in many ways parallel what happens between adults and children as they move into and of course the adult language learners have this filter of their first language that can cause problems and slow down the process, right?
Yeah, and I could also mention for our audience that I saw the study on sarcasm with Korean students, for example. So that would be another
that's a very interesting one, because in Korean, sarcasm is rarely, if ever, used for humor. It's always insulting. Whereas in English, in at least American English, and I think British English as well, it's used a lot for humor. And so a lot of like comedy routines and television shows and so on are built around sarcasm. That if you don't understand it as a humorous, humor creating activity, you're going to miss the point, right? And there have been studies done, for example, on sarcasm and metaphor, where the person can understand the language of the metaphor, but they uptake it in exactly the opposite way of which it is intended. So they'll uptake it as negative because in their culture it's negative, whereas it's intended as a positive, and vice versa. Right? Yeah.
As a Japanese teacher, also I could say that there is this indirect communication in Japanese, and sometimes I love you means I hate you. And to really grasp when that happens and how it was said and all of that, it requires a different kind of skill, a different skill set.
It shows up, for example, in English, in sort of colloquial everyday English, where you can use negative terms in a positive way. So you can say something that's really sick. Or that's really bad, and it means good. Right? Because the normal positive term isn't strong enough to convey the meaning, so you use the negative, the opposite term, to mean something really good, right? And that has to be difficult for people to understand. So you can be, and we've done studies on this, you can be highly proficient in let's say, sort of everyday communicative activity.
Hmm.
But when it comes to actually using the language to mediate your own thinking,
Mm.
that's not so easy. That becomes difficult. And we found that when people try to mediate themselves through another language, even if they're socially, communicatively proficient, they
Hmm.
have a hard time doing it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, they often have to switch to their first language
Mm-hmm.
as a tool for thinking.
Uh, why don't we work our way to mediation? So first, you just
Mhm.
mentioned this phrase, humans are animals and they are not animals at the same time. So
Mhm.
can you please elaborate on this and tell the audience how this relates to these terms, lower and higher mental processes?
Yeah. So you have to come at this understanding that Vygotsky was fundamentally a dialectical thinker,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which he uh, I would say appropriated from his reading of Marx,
Mm-hmm.
uh, right, as a quintessential dialectical thinker, right, in his writings about sociopolitical, socioeconomic systems of his time. And so Vygotsky, uh, the concepts that he developed were largely dialectical concepts. And until you understand that, it's really hard to appreciate the full power of the theory,
Mm.
right? And so and so as you move through the different concepts of the theory,
Yeah.
you need to be on the lookout for these dialectical relationships, right? So units of analysis are dialectical relations. Mediation is about dialectics. The relationship between lower and higher systems is dialectic, right?
Mm.
So just with that particular and what we're talking about is internal dialectics, right? Not uh, internal. By internal, he means necessarily connected. That is, you can't have one without the other,
Okay.
right? So not just things that are opposite, but things that whose very existence depends on the other,
Okay.
depends on the opposite, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to develop a higher cultural system of thinking, right? You can't just build it on culture. You need to have the opposite, which is the biological. So you need to start with the biological, but the biological in and of itself, our instincts, for example, um, right? So we're all born with certain instincts, reflexes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So somebody throws an object at you, you move out of the way without thinking, otherwise you'll get hit, right? Um, the reflex of survival, right, is something that's biologically endowed in all human beings with normal brains and bodies, right? So on. But he says that's not enough to create an adult mind. You need something else. You need its dialectical opposite, which is something that's external and unique to humans. And for Vygotsky, that was culture, right? Now, so he says you can't have a human being without the biological. So that's the necessary base. But on the other hand, you can't have a human adult consciousness without the cultural side. And the cultural side without the biological side makes no sense. That's an impossibility, right? And the biological side without the cultural side is an impossibility. So you need both of them to 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 integrate, right?
Okay.
So this is why he was interested in children. So he studied children from infancy, and he actually spent time studying the human brain to try to figure out what the contributions of biology are to the formation
Mm-hmm.
of of the adult human mind, right? Um, and he reasoned that whatever biology doesn't supply, it must come from the culture. It must be this other part of the other pole of the dialectic, right?
Okay. Okay.
And so as a child grows into the culture, the biological system is restructured, right?
Mm.
So our biological system is comprised of capacities or instincts that operate independently of each other. So we have a natural memory, we have a natural perception, we have a natural attention. You hear a loud noise, you turn to it, right?
Hmm.
Without thinking. Or you see a bright flash, turn to it without thinking. Um, but then when culture gets into the act through um, through semiotic forms of mediation,
Hmm.
right, which uh, it, it it restructures the instincts into a unified um, higher system, right? Which is a voluntary system, right? So what is originally not voluntary becomes voluntary. So that we have an intentional memory, we have intentional perception. That is, we can decide to pay attention to certain things and not other things.
Hmm.
We can decide to remember certain things and not other things. And we can decide how to remember them, right?
Hmm.
Now, our biological mind is our biological capacities are still there. So we can still react reflexively to a loud noise or something, thrown at us, right? We can still do that. But we also now have the capacity to take that instinct and make it cultural and um, control it intentionally,
Yeah.
right? And so we build then this unified system through the dialectical interconnection of the biological endowment with the cultural endowment, and that gives rise to this higher psychological system,
Okay. Very good.
right? And the process of doing that is what he calls mediation, right? So that the culture mediates the biology and restructures it into this new system.
Okay. Very well. Now, in this theory and in this process, we also have additional terms, which are artifacts and tools. So, how would these terms play into this process of mediation?
So artifacts and tools are, I mean, in some parts of his writings, he used them more or less interchangeably, right?
Okay.
So one of the things you have to keep in mind when you read Vygotsky, and this took me a while to realize,
Mm.
is that his own thinking developed from what he wrote in 1925 to what he wrote in 1934, just before he passed away, right?
Okay.
So you can't you can't look at what he said in 24 or 25 in the same way that you look at what he wrote in 20 and 34, 33, right?
Mm.
Because his thinking changed. He started out by using Pavlovian reflexology, basically behaviorism,
Mm.
as sort of the core of his thinking. And then by the time the late 20s came around, he jettisoned that from the theory. He moved away from it into semiotics, right? And things that Pavlov would hate because you can't observe meaning, right? It's something that's not material, supposedly, right? So he often used the terms like tools for thinking and artifacts, cultural artifacts, as somewhat interchangeable. But I think what he meant by tool is just like, and here he used the analogy um, to physical tools, which comes from Marx, right?
Hmm.
So humans have the capacity to use tools to mediate their relationship to the material world, to the physical world, right? So, we can dig a hole in our garden with our hands, just like animals can with their paws, right?
Hmm.
But we can dig a better hole with the shovel, and
Mm.
we can dig an even better hole with the machine,
Hmm.
right? With the backhoe or whatever you want to call it, right? Um, so it it and those tools are created by culture. So they're cultural artifacts, but they're only functional if they're actually used, right? So Marx has this famous uh, passage in his what's called the Grundrisse, the sort of the basis, sort of the found his early version of Capital, which would eventually become Capital,
Mm-hmm.
where he talks about um, artifacts that are not used, in essence, are not are not artifacts. So he says, a dress that's not worn is not a dress.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a house that's not lived in is not a house. So in a sense, when Marx and Vygotsky think about artifacts, they're thinking about them more as verbs than as nouns.
Okay.
So they're not objects. They're objects that enable doings, that enable activity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And same with tools like shovels and hammers and so on. They're completely useless, and you don't know what they're for until you actually see them in action, right? So you have no idea what a hammer is for until you see somebody hammering, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've never seen a hammer before, you don't know what it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know it's a physical object, but you don't know that it's for driving nails into wood, right? So Vygotsky then reasoned that if we on that analogy that it might be the case that semiotic systems like language are also artifacts created by cultures, and they're used by members of that culture for thinking,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they become tools for thinking. And we can think through language and these semiotic tools in ways that we can't without them,
Okay.
right? So it's like digging a hole with your hands. Just if you just have your instincts, that's not enough, right? You can make your memory work better by using tools. You can make your perception work better by using
Yeah.
tools, right? And
Yes.
these tools
Perhaps
are language.
perhaps we can use this example. So here we see that from a symbolic artifact, we move on to a symbolic tool. For example, learning how to use a table as an external symbolic tool. And then the next part of the diagram is from symbolic tool to psychological tool in a
Yeah.
process of internalization. And the example is thinking about data in a tabular form.
Yeah. So there's a metaphor there, right? So when you think about a table, a statistical table, it's
Mm-hmm.
not a real table. It, it's not the same thing as what you're sitting in front of, right? Or when I'm sitting in front of, I'm sitting in front or behind a table, right? Um, so you can see that there has been uh, a cultural shift, right, in the meaning of that particular artifact from the material object to a symbolic object, which is the statistical table, which allows us to think differently um, about data, for example, and so on and so forth, right? Now, interestingly, not all cultures, Alexei Kutsulin in his new book
Mm-hmm.
on culture, what is it called? Cultural mind, the
Mm-hmm.
cultural mind shows that some cultures have no idea what tables are or diagrams are or graphs are. They
Yeah.
don't use them in the culture, right? And so to move into a culture that uses them, just like a culture that doesn't have a concept moving into a culture that does have a particular concept, that that takes some effort to be able to understand and to master and appropriate, right, that particular artifact as a tool for thinking, right? So tables and graphs and art and diagrams are tools for thinking,
Yes. Okay.
right? They have a material side and they also have a symbolic side.
How does mediation relate to the concept of social cognition in SET?
I'm not sure that's in Vygotsky's in the theory, all cognition is social.
Okay.
right? All higher cognition is social, right?
Mhm.
In fact, the term that he uses to describe it is because of its origins in social in the social environment. He describes thinking as always quasi-social, right? Because if you go back in time into its formation, its historical formation, you
Mm.
can see that that its source is social. And so how we think, what we think about, right, in our higher system, is always historically social.
Okay.
He describes it quasi-social, right? So I don't think he will. I don't think he ever uses anything similar to social cognition.
Hmm.
Um, it's just he does occasionally use the term cognition,
Yeah.
but he mostly uses the term consciousness or mind. Um,
Is mediation only understood as a component of this historical change, as a component of this development, or is mediation more of an everyday thing that we do in our psychology?
um, Mediation is always at work.
Hmm.
It's always there's always this, and this is something that we've been discussing in our reading group and with uh, a couple of my colleagues
Hmm.
about um whether language is always the mediational tool for thinking, right? Now,
Mm.
one of the things that Vygotsky, I think, makes clear, although I'm not 100% certain, but I think when he talks about uh, the role of language in thinking, he's talking about verbal consciousness. And he recognizes that there's other kinds of thinking, like the thinking of an artist or the thinking of a mathematician who might think purely in terms of symbols. It's still mediated, right? So it's still symbolic, but it may not involve language per se, right?
Mm.
Vera Johnsteiner, who was one of the most important uh, Vygotsky scholars, passed away a few years ago,
Mhm.
wrote a very interesting book in the mid 80s called Notebooks of the Mind. And one of the things she did was she interviewed fairly famous people in different professions, including writers, novelists. I think she interviewed Chomsky, uh, choreographers, mathematicians, and asked them, if they could somehow inform her in terms of what their thinking is like and what their notebooks look like, right? So for example, when I think Virginia Woolf, the author, was one of the people she interviewed, and when Virginia Woolf was preparing to write a novel, her notes were just uh, condensed private speech writing. So chapter one, and it would be described in 2 words, and chapter two would be described in maybe 1 word, right? And
Mhm.
so that whole chapter would emerge from this single word that was like a black hole, a semantic black hole
Mhm.
that contained an awful lot of meaning for a writer, right, who makes their living with words. But a choreographer, when she looked at their notebooks, there was no language involved at all. It was just drawings of different dance movements, right? Um, so that thinking was mediated, I would say, visually by still an artifact, right? But in
Mhm.
this case, it was a drawing.
Yeah.
And same thing with mathematicians. Their thinking is mediated by artifacts, but they're numbers, right?
Mm-mm.
And other kinds of symbols, not language, right? So the thinking is always mediated by some cultural artifact, but it's
Mm-mm.
not necessarily language. What
Yeah.
Vygotsky was interested in, and I think why he was interested in language, was that it was so pervasive and
Hmm.
that it was the common, ordinary, everyday way that most of us think
Hmm.
through the language. Now, he wasn't saying that language and thinking are the same thing. right? He wasn't saying that speaking and thinking are the same thing. And that, of course, as you know, is a controversial issue now
Yes.
in philosophy and cognitive science, right?
Mhm.
And the debates are raging over that. That
Yeah.
wasn't Vygotsky's claim. His claim was that thinking was mediated by language. That is, so you could think, the way he described it was the beginnings of a thought are not, don't involve language, but the completion of the thinking, at least in our everyday lives, right?
Mhm.
And most of us who make our living through verbal means,
Mhm.
um, the language completes the thinking process, especially when you have to externalize it, to
Mhm.
communicate it to someone else, right? And this was another crucial dialectic that he wrote about. And that's the difference between social speech and inner or private speech, right? And so when we communicate, the struggle that we have is to put the meanings that we've created through our private inner speech, which is what he described as sense, and there's a Russian term for it, which is smysl,
Mhm.
right? And the communicative meaning, which he described in Russian as значение, that is this is the generalizable meaning that we use when we talk to other people, where we usually communicate in concepts, right? So, for example, if you describe a situation where you're maybe walking home from the office and a tree falls in front of you, right? You mostly describe it as a tree using the concept of tree, which doesn't actually exist in the world. There are no such thing as trees. There are maples and oaks and pines and palms, right? But there's no tree as such.
Mhm.
And what most of us would say is that there's a tree fell in front of me, right? That's using the concept. We probably wouldn't say a palm tree or a maple tree unless that were completely relevant
Mhm.
to, to what it is we wanted to say, right? So this difference between using concepts to communicate and using and transferring our particular personal sense
Mhm.
of the concept was was a dialectical struggle, right?
Mhm.
So for example, that it was a maple tree. If you understand what a maple tree is, you can identify it by its leaves and so on and so forth. But you're probably not going to communicate it that way. You're going to convert it into a generalizable meaning, which most people will understand if you have the concept tree, and not all cultures have the concept tree. Um, you will communicate it in that way, right? So you get this really interesting dialectic between our personal meaning and our social communicative
Mhm.
meaning, and which makes it sometimes difficult to express fully what it is we want to communicate, we want to say to the other person,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and we rely on that I mentioned it earlier, that kind of functional overlap of meaning. We have
Yes,
to
and
rely.
we also use gesture,
Mhm.
right? So gesture is really important to convey meaning, and sometimes, as David McNeil shows, um, the inner meaning that we can't express verbally comes out in our gestures,
Yeah.
right? And this shows up very well in Spanish compared to English,
Yeah.
because Spanish, when you want to communicate uh, motion events, right? So Spanish doesn't have a lot of motion verbs. It has basic motion verbs, right? Saltar, correr, etc. But English has a massive amount of motion verbs
Mhm.
where you can express very subtle meanings like trudge and slog and skip and crawl, which are difficult to communicate verbally in Spanish, but you can do it through gestures.
Mhm.
So, and we've done quite a bit of research on this,
Okay.
showing that the inner speech, the sense, can come out in your hands and your facial
Yeah.
expressions, but they can't come out in the verbal because the language doesn't have that capacity yet,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So
and
that's very interesting, and that's an area where it's very hard to make that transition from a language like Spanish into English to communicate motion events, right, verbally. And the opposite is going from English to Spanish, where you're looking for a verb that allows you to communicate something like trudge or slog,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can't find it in a dictionary. So how
Mm-hmm.
do you communicate it? And what often happens is people then become disfluent because they can't find,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't realize you can do it with your hands.